All right, so everybody, welcome to the Cleveland area user group. Really appreciate everybody coming. We got some great speakers lined up for you guys today, so I think we'll have some really great content. First up is going to be Jason Sandys. And if you aren't, I'll do a quick plug here for the group. If you aren't already a member, head on out to the meetup site, meetup.com/CLESCUG, CLESCUG. You can join there. We try to meet 3 or 4 times a year and try to get, as good of a speaker lineup as we have today each and every time. So, and if you're interested in speaking or presenting at the group, do not hesitate to reach out. I do run the Twitter account at CLESCUG, so you can feel free to direct message me there or just shoot me an email. Happy to have anybody that's interested in speaking come and present to the group. So this is Frank Ampetus talking, by the way, in case you guys didn't know that. And I am a customer engineer, formerly PFE, for those that are more familiar with that term, at Microsoft. So with that being said, I am going to turn it over to Jason and let him do his thing. Jason, do you want, I'll let you, I guess, kind of talk through it, but you let me know if you want questions throughout and I can monitor chat and do all that stuff for you.
Yeah, cool. If I don't see something, definitely call it out, please.
Okay, cool.
So, thank you for the quick intro. There's a little bit of background feed there, so hopefully I can talk over that. Okay, all good there. So yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining for sure. So quick, let me do this. Let me turn on my camera here so you guys can actually see me and make it at least a little bit like we're in person. I'm going to go ahead and I'll share out my session there as well. Cool. So real quick, by way of introduction, my name is Jason Sandys. I'm a program manager now for Microsoft. I work on the engineering team that works on MEM. So my little enclave within the engineering group is called the Customer Acceleration Team. We are specifically focused on accelerating customers, right? It's really what it comes down to, getting them implemented on our MEM solution set, right, which includes Intune, Config Manager, Desktop Analytics, there's Group Policy Analytics now, there's Autopilot. And really our main charter is to figure out what's blocking customers from implementing any one of these products or solutions, and to figure out what the best road ahead is. So that includes a lot of different things, but it's still working with customers, right? Because we have to understand their business cases, their use cases, to define that direction going ahead. So previously, it's been almost 11 months now. I was a consultant doing lots of config manager and MVP for a long time before that. So I have a lot of customer empathy. Usually no sympathy, but empathy. And sometimes there's a little bit of, I don't know, derision in there as well, because customers are customers, but we know at the end of the day, we want you all to use our products. And so that's definitely what our teams focus on. To Sam's comment in there, all I have to do is say scoreboard yesterday, right? So yeah. Please, and Frank said he's going to monitor as well, but go ahead and put questions in the chat. Come off mute as well, right? Be a little bit cognizant that there's lots of people on, but I think coming off mute should be fine if you want to jump in and ask questions about anything that we talk about here, so we can go down any rabbit holes that y'all want to go on. So quickly, the session is something that hopefully is super germane to y'all. It is for just about every customer that I work with. It's something that's been a huge topic within Microsoft as well over the past really 7 or so months, and clearly since COVID, right? Since everyone basically got kicked out of their offices, sent home, sent to work from wherever. So this is it might seem like kind of a little bit of an older topic, but it's not. It's really relevant, and it's something that we're having to guide customers on constantly, particularly in the new environment. Okay, so first slide here, and this is really talking about, hey, what's happened in the last year. I think we've all lived this. I don't have to explain most of this to folks But it is something, the scenario itself at the scale it's at is certainly new, but right, the challenges around it aren't new. We've had folks working from home for at least the last 10 years, right? Or our road warriors working from Starbucks, McDonald's, wherever for a while now. So the challenges aren't new, but the scale that we're facing them at is new. And also the fact that literally every single customer, right? I'm sure there's a few exceptions in there, right? A nuclear power plant can't really do this, but just about every single customer has this challenge now is, right? How do we enable our users to work from anywhere, and how do we administer their devices no matter where they're at as well? So that if you've gone back and you've seen any of my other sessions at MMS, or any time that we've ever talked about quote unquote modern, that first bullet really encompasses the vision of modern, right? Modern is definitely a little bit of an ambiguous term. And of course, what's modern going to be in 5 years if today is modern and what we're doing today is modern? But at any rate, it's really about that anywhere, right? I think that's the key word in there, and we all know that. We all have been feeling that now for at least the last 11 months. We have a steady stream of customers. I see this both in social media as well as in our internal conversations of customers. And this continues to happen, right? Is, hey, we sent our entire workforce home. Now what? How do we manage them, right? We don't have a VPN, or our VPN is overloaded. Or we have people that just aren't connecting to our VPN. How do we overcome these challenges? There's no perfect statement there in the old world, right? In the non-modern world, right? The non-modern world was really designed in the 90s, right? Everyone went to the office every single day. Everyone had a desktop on their desk, right? And even the early 2000s, this was still more or less the true statement. And so everything around that's the premise, is that everything is hooked into our on-premise environment. And it's a lock-in, right? We're setting our users up for failure. We're setting our administrative tasks up for failure when things are locked into our on-prem environment. And then, of course, the other piece around this is, multiple devices. And I'm not going to talk a lot about other operating systems here. This is explicitly focused on Windows 10. But at the end of the day, most people still have multiple devices. I have 3 Microsoft laptops, right, that I kind of shift between, right? I've got a Surface laptop 3 that's here sitting on my desk that I sometimes take with me when I go on the road. I have a Pro, and I have a Go as well that I grab every now and then for small things, right? And so if I'm locked into one single device, right, my data, my applications, my access, any of those kinds of things, then I'm setting myself up for failure. And of course, IT that's given me these things is setting me up for failure as well, right? Because if there's that one document that I need and it's not on all 3 of my devices, or really accessible on all 3 of my devices, then I'm potentially going to have issues, and I'm going to forget to move it where I need. I'm not, putting it on a thumb drive is insecure. There's lots of things that go along with that. And so once again, none of these challenges are new, right? We've all had these challenges over the past 15, 20 years in the workforce in IT. But over the past year, they've become super acute and super pervasive as well. The one thing I've said before, and I've said this a few times in different user groups and that, is basically, if we could hop into a time machine and go back 5, 10 years, really 10 years is the genesis of a lot of this. And we can say, hey, everyone's going to get sent home because we're going to have a pandemic, right? And no one's going to work from the office for an extended period of time, right? 12 plus months. How do we handle this from an IT perspective? Well, I will propose to everyone, and I think this is absolutely true. And we clearly had no idea that this was coming, right? We didn't have a crystal ball, we being Microsoft. We didn't have that, foreknowledge that this was going to happen, but we did know that more and more work was going to this modern workplace, this work from wherever you are, right? So the little picture on there is the one I love to call out. So, how many of us wouldn't love the work at the beach itself, right? And I've actually done some work at the beach before, right? And I'm sure we've all had these interesting places that we've all done work from. And so being able to do that is what modern is all about at the end of the day. So. Okay, next slide. There was one quick question from Tim here. Actual how do we get there? So I'll discuss a little bit of that as well, and if we have time, we can go on some of that tangent as well. So. So some key points here. These are some recurring themes that we see constantly here. Some really things to keep in mind around all of the things that I talk about going forward in the slide deck. So first, an Azure device identity. It's really the core of everything that we're doing at Microsoft. It's the core of modern management. We have to have that device identity based in Azure because it's an enabler for a bunch of other technologies. And I have a list on the slide later in the deck as well, so we'll talk about that. So that's modern. That's the way to be modern, right? It's not that lock into something that's on-prem. And so that's, once again, the air quotes, modern management and the modern desktop, the modern workplace, modern whatever, right? It's all that characterization of that keyword anywhere, right? IT from anywhere, basically. The other thing, and this is the big hammer that customers, anyone that's advocating for this, like we clearly are, can always pull out, is security. And that's what Zero Trust is all about. So if you guys haven't at least started reading a little bit about Zero Trust and how to implement it and what that means in your environment, I heavily encourage you to do so. We have an entire section of the Microsoft website dedicated to Zero Trust. Right. And Zero Trust is really built on modern management as well, right? It's talking about a lot of those things I talked about on the last slide, so that we don't care what device that the user's on. You know, they could technically be on their mother-in-law's laptop, right? Or their mother-in-law's desktop because they're, you know, over there for Thanksgiving or, you know, whatever, for a holiday meal. We don't care, you know, where that user is necessarily at, right? We want to put controls around these things, but we don't want to actually micromanage what the user's doing, because that's not what the modern workforce wants or needs. They need to be able to work from everywhere. And once again, over the last 12 months, we've clearly seen this play out. But we want that access, we want that control to all be secure as well. And so having that Azure AD identity on the device itself, and of course the user, but the device is really what we're talking about here. The device, that's the underpinnings of all of this. The next is a point that we, Microsoft, haven't stressed enough over the past few years. It was clearly when we introduced this technology, it was there, it was actually stated. But it's not something, and across the board, right? When we're talking services, we're talking engineering, we're talking everything within Microsoft. We're even talking the messages that we gave to partners. We were never clear enough about this. This is something that's really become firm over the last few months, though, and it's something for everyone to keep in mind, is that Hybrid Azure AD domain joining your devices, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is if you're not familiar in a couple slides here. But it's a temporary enabler. It is not meant to be a long-term solution in an environment, right? If you're planning out what you're going to do next in your environment, or not next necessarily, but where your environment is going to end up, if your end goal is to get to Hybrid Azure AD domain join, you're doing it wrong, right? And that's a bold statement. Always telling someone they're doing it wrong is bold. But in this case, it's 100% true. It's not meant to be an end goal for any environment. The last bullet point, fear mongering here, don't zone in and read too much into that term that's in there. It's read that more, the FUD, the fear and uncertainty and doubt around Azure AD domain join. There's a handful of things that are floating around out there, and a lot of it, I think another way to potentially characterize this bullet is just ignorance. I don't like using the word ignorance typically because it has a very negative connotation, but we're all ignorant of lots of things, right? You don't know what you don't know. In this case, it's kind of a willful, I don't know, right? It's the new thing, even though it's been around for a few years, but a lot of IT organizations haven't even thought about investigating what Azure AD domain join means to their environment. And so that's not a good place to be, because that's definitely where we want most organizations to be. We want them either to be fully on-prem. So going back to our wonderful nuclear power plant, right? That's going to be a fully on-prem entity. And there's nothing that we're going to do to change that. And we don't want to change that, right? None of us have any desire to change what a nuclear power plant is or how they operate, for lots of different reasons. Or you're going to be a cloud-based environment, right? So that you can enable that modern, which once again, and I keep coming back to this because it's the clear, right? Anytime anyone says, hey, we can't do this because we don't like the cloud, because we don't feel the cloud is insecure. Anyone who said that 12 months ago isn't saying that anymore, because if they are still saying it, they probably went out of business, right? It's the reality. You have to embrace it. things are just never going to go back to all on-prem, with, once again, the handful of exceptions. So don't believe really the fear. Don't believe that this can't work for you, particularly if you've never gone down the path to investigate it, right? There's a lot of things. Don't believe what people say can't work as far as full Azure AD domain join goes. Okay, so real quick, just some level setting here. Right, why do we join devices to a domain? Now, this could be Azure AD, this could be on-prem AD, doesn't really matter. But these are generally the three things. There are other ancillary pieces in here, but these are the main three things, right? It's about users logging into that device, having a centralized identity so that they don't have a different account basically on every device, right? And different credentials on every single device. A lot of people don't necessarily have shared devices, but this goes when they get a new device or when they log into that terminal server, right? Or, right, when we start extending this to the modern world and to modern services like Exchange Online, right, having that single set of credentials is really what it comes down to from that central directory. Enforcing policies. Now, this is an interesting point because, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about Azure AD, there really is no policy engine that's built into Azure AD itself. If we could go back in time 20 to 25 years ago and debate with the folks that actually came up with this, probably was never a good idea to put group policy as part of AD. It was a real win at the time, for sure, but having it as a separate piece would have solved so many issues over the past 20 years. But we can't go back and change history. We don't have that time machine, unfortunately. And the last one is we establish trust, right? That's how some other entity, the domain, and other things that trust the domain itself can trust our workstations now as well. On-prem domain, this isn't such a big concept, but with Azure AD, this is a huge concept, and it goes back to that zero trust piece, right? It is one of those things that allows zero trust to work, right? Is we can trust this device, or it is a factor that goes into trusting that device, is now we know that it is associated with our directory and it's a known entity. Now we can put other factors, and we almost certainly want to put other factors in there, right, to validate that that device is trusted, right, on a Windows device, whether it has up-to-date antivirus, whether it has the firewall on, all those wonderful things that come with conditional access, basically, if you're familiar with conditional access. But there's potentially more to it than that even as well. So it's kind of the baseline, right? This is why we typically do these kinds of things. So in an Azure world, and sorry, this is a build slide I copied from someone else and I didn't realize was a build slide. So let me build it all out. There are three basic ways of associating our Windows 10 devices with Azure AD. The column on the right is the one that we'll kind of discount right off the bat. And notice it's not really a Windows device there, it's a mobile device. This is definitely, everything I'm talking about here is Windows 10. So Azure AD registered is the only way to go for your iOS and Android. So that this statement isn't really talking about those, but it's really about BYOD, right? And that's what we always associate Azure AD registered with, is the BYOD scenario. If you've ever tried to do BYOD on Windows 10, you'll realize really quick that there's a lot of things that don't line up really well. Windows 10 was never really designed with BYOD in place. I know a lot of organizations are attempting to do it. It's something that we've discussed internally quite a bit. I don't know exactly what the path forward there looks like, but the real, as far as Azure AD goes, registering your device to Azure AD should generally only be considered for those BYOD type scenarios. We shouldn't do that for corporate owned assets. So that leaves us with the other two. And the key thing to point out, aside from clearly all the text below, which I won't read, is when we look at the hybrid Azure AD scenario, the thing to really key in here, and this is something that folks don't always know or realize, is that this is really just an on-prem AD join device, right? The device state itself, you're logging in using your on-prem AD identity, right? You're not using your Azure AD identity to actually log into that device. So it's still dictated by everything that was normally there for your on-prem AD. We've simply associated it with Azure AD. That's the additional piece that's there. Whereas, of course, in the Azure AD world, or when we do an Azure AD join, we are joining it to Azure AD. So the device state itself looks like, right? And really the Windows 10 system itself, right? At least at the surface level, there's lots of deep things here, but at the surface level, the domain is a domain is a domain, right? Whether it's Azure AD or on-prem AD, it doesn't really matter. So you can only be joined to one or the other. So that's why the hybrid Azure AD domain join is almost a misnomer. You got to be real careful when you talk about it that people don't make false assumptions around this. The device itself is still fully on-prem AD domain joined and still subject to all of the controls that are there from your on-prem domain. Okay, so as promised before, here are all the things, and there could absolutely be other ones. This is me scouring and looking around at different resources of all the things that you need an Azure AD identity for. So this is, and device identity is the thing I want to be real specific about, right? Because we have two different identities here. There's a user identity, which we're not talking about here at all, really. There's going to be a couple references to it, but it's not about the user identity. It's about the device identity. The device itself has to have an Azure AD identity. So it's either hybrid or fully Azure AD domain joined to do any of these things on this list here, right? You know, some of the key ones and the ones at the top, I have a complete slide for because the second bullet point there, the on-prem resources, that's one that's most people completely have no idea that actually exists. It's probably the number 2 reason that we hear people don't want to go to fully Azure AD domain joined. And like I said, I'll discuss that a little bit more. So you can kind of ruminate on that until I get to the slide that discusses that. But there's other things in here. Co-management. I think Timothy's question, you know, had some co-management pieces in there as well. Yeah, we absolutely have to have that Azure AD identity for us to do co-management. Self-service password reset. That's one that we've seen a lot of customers. That's a driver for hybrid. Co-management's a driver for hybrid. Enterprise state roaming, not so much. BitLocker recovery. You know, it makes life a lot easier if you can just get your recovery key up to Azure AD. Once again, this is that modern scenario, right? Our user sitting at Starbucks boots up their system, and all of a sudden the BitLocker recovery kicks in for whatever reason, right? How do they get that key back? Well, most likely users are going to call the help desk. But what if they haven't been connected in a while, right? Or what if they haven't been connected to on-prem when we're using an on-prem solution to get that AD escrow or that recovery key escrow to actually kick in? Right. It solves it. Connectivity is always an assumption, right? If we don't have internet connectivity, all bets are off on everything that we do. So we always have to assume that. But having that ability for them to escrow the key now and rotate the key, right? That's part of the escrow process as of 1909, I believe. That's a great feature, and we don't have to care if they've ever VPN'd in or not, right? That's another piece that's in here. So these are all things that, once again, you need to have that Azure AD identity on the device itself. Most of these things actually do work for registration as well. They definitely all work for hybrid and for full Azure AD, but remember, registration is not something that we want to encourage at all. And we want to move away from that if we can, except on our BYOD devices. Okay, so this really leads, and we got this flare maybe from one of those first slides, right? Why we shouldn't be doing hybrid Azure AD domain join. The top one is the key one, right? And this is the one that people traditionally, right, over the past 20 years have solved using a VPN solution. But we all know, right, getting users to even log into VPN, that's sometimes problematic. There are always on VPNs that do sometimes address these types of issues. But once again, 12 months ago, I heard this story from, it is usually schools, unfortunately, but from a lot of schools was, hey, we just sent all of our teachers and staff home. And they have no way of getting back in. What do we do now, right? They didn't even have a VPN. Or there were lots of organizations, right? If you followed the big bank, right? Everyone kind of knows, or hopefully knows who the big bank is. They had this issue initially, and they weren't alone. There were tons of folks that had this issue. Is, hey, our VPN just, it falls over every day at 9 a.m., right? Because everyone's just getting to work and starting to work, or not getting to work, getting out of bed, rolling into wherever they're working, and they get onto VPN, and then their VPN falls over because they simply don't have enough capacity. And so now all of a sudden they have to go to their vendors and figure out, either buy more licensing, buy more bandwidth, buy more whatever that they need at that point in time. All because they're constrained and limited, and they have to have that on-prem connection. And the same thing happens here with the domain controllers, right? We've all had the remote user, or we've at least all heard about the remote user that forgot their password. We've all done that, forgotten a password. Remote users tend to do this a lot more frequently, much to our chagrin, but they do. And so how do you change that remote user's password? It's particularly if they don't have a VPN, right? You don't. That's the whole point here. You need that line of sight. And let's say they're just trying to get into Exchange Online. Okay, well, I can change their Azure AD password. I can change that online identity, but that doesn't affect the profile that's been cached down, right? So you still have an issue, and now the user's confused, and it makes life just that much more difficult. So there are lots of these types of issues, right? Group policy itself, right, doesn't come down at startup. So anything you have going for startup, like startup scripts, right, because you don't have that VPN necessarily unless it's an always-on VPN initially. And once again, none of these are new issues. These issues have been around for 20 years. They've just become really acute and really widespread over the past 12 months. The second main bullet point on this page is a huge one that, once again, we definitely did a very poor job of publicizing. And this is going to come probably as a shock to most people that are seeing this one. It's something that in the social media forums I've tried, maybe not as politically correct as I could, but I've tried to let folks know about this one. And so remember, this is specifically in the context of hybrid Azure AD domain join. If we're doing Azure AD domain join during autopilot, deploying the CM agent is completely fine. If you're deploying the CM agent during autopilot and hybrid Azure AD domain joining, and the statement on this bullet is a little bit strong. It's not that it's not explicitly supported, it's that we don't have an explicitly supported path. So what does that mean? It means that you kind of have to invent your own path, but that doesn't mean that that path is supported, and it doesn't mean you won't run into issues. We know of specific technical issues around this scenario because there's an identity change that happens on the client when you hybrid Azure AD domain join during autopilot. We know this causes customer pain. We have tons of cases around this. And it's because we never designed for this scenario and we never documented how to complete this scenario. So all the component pieces that go into it, fully supported, but it's trying to put those all together, make them all line up in that perfect line, getting all your ducks in a row, if you will. That's the piece that, is it supported? Is it not supported? We're not really going to say yes or no, but what we are going to say is we're not necessarily going to guarantee results, which, I mean, if you read between the lines, it's more or less the same thing as saying it's unsupported. The current statement is if you need to do this, you need to either deploy the CM agent after autopilot, or really if you're still in that hybrid Azure AD domain join mode, this is kind of the other piece that comes out of this, is you're still on-prem. Why are you trying to do modern provisioning, right? And I know that's a little bit of a debatable statement. It's got some controversy potentially in there. I guess not necessarily controversy the right word, but hopefully you guys get what I mean. But at the end of the day, right, modern provisioning is about that. You're doing modern things. If you're doing hybrid still, you're not modern yet, right? But if you want to go modern, then you need to go modern, which means don't do hybrid because hybrid is not modern. There is a contradiction in the pathways that are actually there. So, right, like I said, bold statement. Some people have gotten this to work fully, right? So it's not to say that it can't work, once again, but it's to say that we don't define a supported path to get it to work. The no seamless migration path, I think this also kind of goes to Timothy's question there in the chat a little bit earlier as well. And I've got a slide about that, so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And the last one is policy conflicts, right? The whole, I guess one of the underlying reasons, and this is another reason that folks, so, you know, I mentioned the number two reason that we typically hear is because they don't feel that Azure AD domain join systems can actually access on-prem resources. That's typically the second reason we normally hear. The first reason is around group policy, right? That there is no group policy and folks are so heavily invested, and I'll even say in debt to group policy, right? They've sunk themselves in so deeply on group policy that them even imagining that they could dig themselves out or transition anything else out, it's a lot of work to begin with. And so no one wants to set themselves up for a lot of work. And so they don't even think that it's possible, or at least they don't want to consider the possibility. And so they don't. But what we end up having with hybrid is now we have two worlds, right? We have our on-prem group policies that are still enforced on the system, right? They're fully on-prem AD domain join. They're still enforced on the system. Now, they introduce hybrid and then they introduce their MDM. So of course in the Microsoft world that's Intune, but it could be another MDM, right? It could be whatever. I'm any of the competitors that are out there. So it's basically another policy engine. So you've got two policy engines potentially setting the exact same thing. And so this is a very common question that comes up in social media constantly, and customers ask it. It's one of the first questions that every customer I work with asks as well. Is, well, who wins? Well, if you go on social media, you'll have people really quick point out, oh, there's this wonderful setting called MDM wins over GPO. It's part of the policy CSP. So CSPs are configuration service providers. It's part of the built-in agent on Windows 10 for MDM management. So they're basically settings, right? Very similar to what group policy settings are conceptually, technically vastly different, but conceptually they're very similar. And so you set these CSPs, and so which one wins now over group policy? And right, that is that one specific setting that says, it kind of says what it's supposed to do, right? And supposed to is the key phrase here. It says GPO, or it says MDM wins over GPO. If you look at the documentation A for that setting, it only applies to other settings within the policy CSP. That's right. There's lots of different CSP. There's an update CSP. There's a firewall CSP. There's like about 40, 50 different CSPs that are actually built into Windows 10. So that setting only applies to things within the policy CSP, which is a subset of the bigger set of policies. Now, which CSP do settings in Intune actually use? Well, it's not that it's not defined, it's not exposed anywhere. We don't have documentation that says, hey, this CSP is this setting in Intune. So you don't actually know. In addition to that, and it is called out explicitly in the documentation, right, that this only applies to settings within the policy CSP. But in addition to that, it's known actually not to work for even every setting within the policy CSP. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with, well, we still don't know. It's not defined. And why? It goes back to that very key point initially, is hybrid was never designed to be a long-term solution for organizations. It was meant to be an interim solution to get folks off of their on-prem domain for their workstations, right? This has nothing to do with servers. This has nothing to do with getting rid of AD on-prem completely. This is about moving your workstations, because it's your users, the ones that are working from anywhere. It's the users that are taking their laptops, et cetera, to go anywhere. And so it's allowing you as an organization to move to modern while you still have these existing devices in your environment. And so when we go back to talking about policy conflicts, the intent was never to have both of them together, right? We put in this, and I'll put it in air quotes, it's a hack, right? This attempt to have MDM win over group policy. And it works sometimes, and it doesn't work other times. But saying that about anything, would you ever rely on something where that's basically the statement coming from whoever created it? And the answer is explicitly no, right? These are great tires that you just put on your car that, most of the time they won't just deflate, at random times or times that you can't predict. That's clearly not a good thing for anyone to necessarily say. But we're telling you up front, this was never the intent. You're doing something that we didn't intend you to do. And so you need to explicitly control on these hybrid devices. You need to actually say, group policy is the one that's going to win, or these settings are coming from group policy and only group policy, right? So you can use WMI filtering, you can use OUs for targeting, whatever mechanisms you need to make sure only those settings come from group policy. And then only these settings actually come from the MDM provider. So Intune in the case of Microsoft, you have to control those kinds of things, because once again, it's not meant to be a long-term coexistence solution. Okay, I will take a breath here, see if anyone has any comments. There's nothing in the chat window, but anybody want to interject or ask any questions about what I've said so far? Let it all sink in. Okay, let me take a quick drink and then I'll keep going here. Okay, so this is basically an internal slide that gets used a lot by our Azure AD team. And it kind of goes along with that. It also gives you a mentality of where Microsoft is at currently, and always has been, because this is not a new statement whatsoever. Hybrid Azure AD is just not the end goal here. So Sam just put up a question in the chat, very similar kind of to what was posed before, is, well, what do we do for those hybrid machines in the interim? And I have a slide for that, so I'll hold off on that for a little bit here. I think it's 2 slides down the road, but I'm not sure. Yeah, it is. So going back to one of the points before, and this was the number 2 fear reason, right? Or FUD reason, however you want to characterize it, around, hey, I've joined my devices to Azure AD, but they can't get to anything on-prem, right? Well, no, wrong, right? They absolutely can. So the link is there. I put this link there. You can easily search for this. It's a pretty easy link to find. This isn't anything new. This has been in Windows 10 for a while. So anytime, right, that comes up, it's pretty easy to dispel this, and I'll call it a myth. It's not a complete myth. There are times that some things don't work. So the keyword here at the top is that it's user-based access, right? So most of this is all about device and joining your device to Azure AD, right? But most of your on-prem resources, or nearly all on-prem resources in most organizations, are actually user-centric authentication. Your user auth does not depend on your device being joined to a domain, right? I can take a work group system, the system not joined to any domain. I can still get to shares on the network. I can still get to printers on the network. I can still get to all of those things, or nearly all of those things in most environments. No problem. Now, as a user, I'm having to type in my username and password a lot to do those kinds of things, so that's painful. So that's why, as part of Windows 10, there's actually SSO. So if you've synced your identities, there's still an identity sync that has to happen here, right? You have your on-prem AD because that's the gatekeeper. That's the authentication factor for those on-prem resources. You still have that. So you have Azure AD Connect syncing your credentials or syncing your identities up to Azure AD. And by virtue of that, Windows 10 actually knows, hey, this identity was actually synced, right? It actually has knowledge of your on-prem domain, and it can go get the Kerberos ticket, right? The TGT, the same thing that we've always done from your on-prem domain, just like an on-prem domain joined system does, right? So you can still do user auth to all of those on-prem resources. You know, and I definitely hedge my bets a little bit there. You know, I kept saying nearly all and those kinds of things, because there are some known things that won't work. Most or nearly all of those are device-based, though, right? There are a handful of things. One that comes to mind, because I have a customer in this scenario right now, is NPS, right, which is a Microsoft service or a Microsoft product. It's part of Windows Server, right, which is the network policy server or service. I think it's server. It provides 802.1x. It provides radius, right, for folks that are using any of that. And one of the modes that it can be used for is, or is using device identity, right? So there is no device identity here, right? Or at least not in the on-prem where NPS knows where to go look for it. If you choose a modern service or solution for that, it can use Azure AD at that point in time. But unfortunately, NPS hasn't been updated to do that. So there are things that potentially don't work, but the vast majority of things, the customers I've worked with, vast majority, everything just works. The users don't know because, once again, it's seamless, right? Windows 10 knows how to do this in coordination with getting that hint from Azure AD that got synced up because of Azure AD Connect. And so it's all just seamless. The users aren't putting in their additional credentials. All of these kinds of things just work. That document there, it's not a long read. So I definitely encourage everyone, go read it. It doesn't take very long, and it explains a lot of this in depth. And I'm going to post a link real quick in the chat window just so folks have that. I got to go find the actual link here real quick. Just give me 2 seconds. Where are you? There you are. There we go. It's in the chat window now. Cool. So this is the question I think that Sam and I think Timothy was somewhat alluding to before. I think there's some other nuances to Timothy's question as well, is, well, how do we get off these devices that are hybrid Azure AD domain joined? So from the Microsoft perspective, we don't really want you to get off of the device itself. We want you to re-provision the device. So the first key point up there is we're not providing any tooling. That's an explicit design choice by the Azure AD team, that this is not something we want people to do. We feel there's too much risk involved for us as well as the customer when they're doing profile migrations, right? Anyone who's ever worked with USMT and Config Manager and tried to migrate user data, really painful. I know one of the stories that I have around that is, as I was working with an organization and they were doing USMT and they did, and I don't remember, there was a lady, she was, in another building. They did her system, they migrated her data over. Everybody thought it was great, and they were all happy, right? They thought she was a success. Next day, the support person gets a phone call. She's like, "Where are my cats?" Like literally yelling at him, and he's like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." She's like, "My cats, they're all gone." He's like, "Why in the world do I care about your cats?" Of course, he didn't say that. She's like, "Wait a minute, let me walk over to your desk." And he walks over to her desk, and her wallpaper, right? Her wallpaper was a tiled wallpaper of a cat, right? But it was a smaller cat. And so it was a smaller picture. And when she tiled it, there were lots of cats. Well, after the migration, the wallpaper wasn't tiled anymore. So that actually called it, created a support case. Really painful. I mean, user data is just always painful like that. And that's the stupidest, most trivial example that's out there. But it was super important to that end user, clearly, because she had, took the time to actually call someone to come fix it for her. And of course, if it's a business document or something like that that gets lost, that's even more pain. So no one wants to ever have to deal with those kinds of things, and least of all, you guys when you're actually the one that's taking that call of where your cats are at or where the lady's cats are at. So we're not going to build anything, right? That's where we're at. I've heard. I can't vouch for whether they work. I can't vouch for anything about them, but I heard there are a couple commercial tools that you can purchase that will do this. And to be specific, like we've had tools in the past, once again, USMT, right? We've had those kinds of tools in the past. These tools don't work with Azure AD profiles as the target. So you're not going to be able to use it. Or at least let me back up and say they're not supported. I honestly have no idea what the results are going to be, if the tool will flat out fail, if it'll corrupt data. I don't know what it'll actually do if you actually try. So it's not supported to do it at the very least. So where does that leave organizations? It's really about kind of potentially two phases, and you can do this however it makes sense for your organization for those devices that are on hybrid today. And that's really to embrace modern, right? Don't go half in, right? Half in doesn't get you anywhere. It's the Mr. Miyagi, right? Walk right side road, okay. Walk left side road, okay. Walk middle road, squish like grape. I mean, it's very similar here. You have to start embracing, you have to start decoupling, and that's what I talked about was modern at the beginning, is if you're locked into that device, if the user's locked into that device, you've got problems to begin with, because that user is going to run over the device with their car, leave it on the top of their car, right? Let their kid play with it, whatever, right? They're going to lose data because that data is locked into that. And we've all seen this. We've probably all tried to make this argument in our organizations if they haven't already decoupled data. But it's not just about the user data. You've got shared data as well. You've got applications that, one-off applications in organizations, which is a tough thing to handle, right? You've got shadow IT out there doing interesting things, buying one-off applications here and there. And right, you don't always know what those all are, but you've got to get a handle on them. You've got to prevent that user from being so reliant on a single device that that device itself becomes the failure point. And then, of course, your management policies, you've got to decouple it. They've got to be based upon, the user's role, the device's role, those kinds of things, and not an individual user. And so once you've done that, right, and I'm not in any way saying this is an overnight process, every organization is going to have their own timeline for doing it. And that's where hybrid comes in. While you're going through this process, you can handle your existing devices. You can give them that Azure AD identity. So for those existing devices, you don't have to do anything about them initially as you're going through this. And once you make your way through this process, you've made the device itself so it's a commodity, right? Very much like, I don't know, Dell's probably not the great example, but that's what Dell did at the end of the day, right? To the supply chain, everything's just a commodity. They can swap pieces and parts in and out, and there's not one single thing that's critical, like the device itself, like connecting to your on-prem domain, right? Get rid of those hard requirements out of it. Then you can, if you need to keep those existing devices, you can flatten them, right? Because nothing on that device is going to be lost. It's all somewhere else. It's all shareable from somewhere else, accessible from somewhere else, copyable, whatever, however you want to do it. And now you can flatten that device, get the user going again with autopilot, put them into Azure AD, everything just comes back down. Once again, there's probably going to be a little bit of pain for the end user. But we've all done this at home. We actually were on a call yesterday. This was an internal meeting. And with the PM that handles reset in Windows 10. And one of the numbers he put up, I don't remember the exact numbers, but on average, there are, and they keep telemetry on this, of course, there are about, I got to think what the number was. It was around 15 million Windows 10 resets every month, right? It's something that end users are already beginning to be familiar with, right? Resetting their device clean because it, wipes the OS. Well, it doesn't really wipe the OS, it rebuilds the OS. It corrects problems. It does a lot of great things for you. And that's all part of that modern world, right? Being able to reset that device. So users are already getting used to being able to do this. And as long as you don't lose their data, as long as you don't lose their applications, and if you've done this as well, owners in that process, you can do things. But as soon as you get away from that device itself being important and the connection to the on-prem, then a lot of these challenges, a lot of these issues become moot. Taking a step back, of course, I'm not in any way saying that, this is easy, this is trivial, that there isn't work ahead, right? So that's kind of the other piece that we hear into this. And if we go back to kind of that fear-mongering statement that I made, there are a lot of folks that they just see this as a big work obstacle, and they're buried under their own tickets, and they just don't have any chance of moving forward. But that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you're always just going to be buried by the same challenges that this would address, and you don't even ever think about getting out from under those, that pile's just going to keep getting higher and higher and higher. Clearly really easy for me to say since I'm not in those places. But that's the whole point of, being the fire. Do you want to be the firefighter, or do you want to be the engineer, right? Do you want to be the person that's solving the challenges, or just addressing the day-to-day problems, right? And if we can get out from under that pile and we can actually take that bigger view of things, then we can start addressing these problems. We can start getting rid of those source of the issues in the environment. Let's see here. Let me read Tim's comment that came in really quick here. Yeah, so his point is, hey, we're, one of the easy button ways in general is to get user data decoupled from the device is OneDrive, right, from a Microsoft solution. And absolutely, but there's some lacking of reporting in OneDrive. OneDrive is not necessarily within my piece, but definitely raise that feedback up wherever you can, because yes, you as an IT admin, from a perspective of, hey, user, you shouldn't be putting data on the local drive. You can scream that until you're hoarse, and it's just going to fall deaf on a lot of users. So you need to be able to somehow enforce that, or at least be able to report on those kinds of things. And I think that's the intent of the statement there is, right. You need to be able to see who's using OneDrive and who's not using OneDrive, and then you can at that point have a targeted, slap on the wrist session, right? Or, get the ruler out and wrap the knuckle session, however you want to characterize it. Of course, having top-down policies, right? This has to be supported from the CEO, CIO level, whatever the equivalent level in your organization is, has to be supported all the way down. And you have to be able to make bold statements like, hey, if you've got local user data and we swap out your laptop, it's on you. It's not on us, right? It's a huge step to be able to make. But at the end of the day, that really needs to be the statement, because going back to the user losing their laptop, the hard drive dying, whatever, it's the same scenario, right? There's no difference between those two scenarios. There's data that's locked on that drive. It absolutely should be the user's responsibility, and you have to shift it to the user. There's no way you can take responsibility for a user putting data on their local drive and it getting lost for whatever reason, including these reasons here. So yeah, as far as the OneDrive feedback, I'm going to take a note on that and see if I know we have some contexts that go over to the OneDrive, because we need to be able to report on those kinds of things 100%. Okay, I think I've kind of beat that one to death, but at the end of the day, right, it kind of comes down to it's planning out your modern management strategy. Because once you get to modern management, assuming you can realize it, right, and this may be 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road for your org, hopefully not 5, but it's possible, right? You don't care about the device anymore, right? It doesn't matter. They're basically throwaway devices at that point, and that's the intent here. So that's not to say that everything is perfectly rosy, right? I can put on my rose-colored glasses all day long. I can drink the Kool-Aid all day long. I can do all of those kinds of things, but there are some shortcomings that are here. I definitely put current in parentheses here. Some of these we are working to address. Some of these are going to be addressed maybe in ways that you don't expect, and maybe some of these will never get addressed. It totally depends upon priorities. One of the things that's really happened in the past 12 months, and I've seen this intimately, is a lot of things got pushed because of remote management, because of COVID type scenarios. And so that's something to always be cognizant of. Now, most of these you would think kind of fall into that and would be prioritized, but it totally depends. So I talked about the device-based auth, right? Most folks will never see this, honestly. The customers I work with, most of them have never seen any issues in their environment. That's not to say they don't exist, but they haven't actually experienced pain, right? If it's that one user out of whatever your 15,000 users or your 5,000 users that's having pain, well, that one user is probably going to have to suck it up, right, for the good of the rest of IT, right? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Local file sharing, I found this on a list somewhere. I've never actually confirmed that one. So it's debatable, though, when I've talked about this before, whether you should even have local file sharing, right? So that, yeah, maybe it's a technical shortcoming, but is it a good idea in the first place? Probably not, but that's debatable. Remote desktop, somewhat similar, right? Should you even be able to remote desktop to other systems, right? There's reasons for that. So that one's not necessarily as hard of a line there, but that's currently a shortcoming. Dynamic DNS is one that doesn't get enough attention, so I like to call this one out. You can turn off secure updates and you can get dynamic DNS registration. You can actually also sidestep this one by using Microsoft DHCP and letting Microsoft DHCP do the dynamic registration for you. At that point, it's still secure. That assumes you're using Microsoft DHCP though as well. So that one can be problematic, right? If you have things that are reaching out to devices themselves based upon host names, based upon that local DNS, that could be absolutely problematic. It just depends upon the environment. There are ways around it though, so it's not like it's a hard block, but it is something that's not going to just work out of the box magically. And then the firewall profiles, if you're a fan of using different profiles, right? In Windows, we have the 3 built-in profiles. We have the public, the private, and the domain profile. If you're AAD joined, you're always going to go into the public profile, which, if you think about it, right, the whole point here is that the device can be working from anywhere. We don't really care. And in most cases, particularly over the past 12 months, you're not physically on the network anyway. And even if you are physically on the network, do you still trust your physical network? And should you trust your physical network? Shouldn't you just have one profile policy and treat everyone as public? Once again, somewhat debatable, but it's something that you just have to accept at this point in time. To my knowledge, there's going to be no changes there ever. So that is something you'll have to accept and actually work around with. Let's see here. Timothy posted another one. We rely on LAPS. Yes. So LAPS is on the domain, is on the drawing board. There's no commitment. So this is basically an Azure equivalent LAPS solution. It's been a known shortcoming for a while. And there is, I won't say there's necessarily anything to show today, but at this point, we don't have anything to announce or release around LAPS in Azure. It's clearly a security issue as well, though. So it has gotten a lot of attention, and we'll see something in the near future, but not my area. I don't have control over that, so I can't really announce anything there at all. Hopefully sooner than later, though, is the best I can unfortunately say, or fortunately, depending upon your point of view there. So,
hey Jason, we're at about the 5-minute warning here, just to let you know. Sorry.
Okay, perfect. I've got just about that much time left, so that's perfect. And you guys can see the other one. So the local admin group management, the story got a lot better with 20H1, not 20H1, 20H2. And is going to, I think, there are some features coming down the road here as well. But of course, if you're not on 20H1, then that doesn't matter to you anyway. But that has gotten better with the CPS or the configuration service providers. So no group policy. We've talked about that one. Hopefully everyone has at least looked at group policy analytics. It's the whole reason we built group policy analytics, which is part of MEM now, right? Is so that you can analyze those group policies, so that you can get away from that monolithic, old, clunky piece that's group policy and move it over into something modern like Intune. And get away from all the debt, right? The other piece that's really common is folks have 20 years of group policy and no one has a clue what half of it even does anymore, whether it's needed, when it was put there. No one has that documentation. And so we see that as a common issue in a lot of environments. You start troubleshooting things like, well, why do you have this policy? I don't know. Why do you have this policy? I don't know. Right? And you don't even know that it's doing anything in your environment. And so group policy analytics can at least help you analyze that. So that's a great tool. Hopefully everyone's at least looked at that. And then, of course, we don't have OUs in Azure AD. They do have AUs, administrative units, that was just, I think it went public preview or might even be released now. But none of the management, right? None of that is actually centered around that. So at some point we may have AUs, but we're not going to have, you don't have that today. You have to deal with scopes and scope tags, very similar to what we have in Config Manager. So if you're familiar with doing permissioning and roles and that in Config Manager, it's nearly identical to that. But if you're used to hierarchical management like we have with file systems and Active Directory, you're not going to have that today. So, okay, so there's these last two slides are the rubber meets the road here. So here's the explicit guidance from Microsoft. This has always been the case, even though, like I said before, we've never really publicized this very well. We've probably even said things that are counter to this as well, which is very unfortunate, but it is what it is at this point. So the explicit guidance is your existing systems, right? These aren't systems that you're going to carry forward to Azure AD unless you reprovision them, right? You wipe them and reload them, however you want to do that, right? We can do autopilot, we can do OSD and config manager, any of those kinds of things, fine. Hybrid Azure AD, fine, right? But it's not meant to be that long-term solution. Your new systems, you 100% should be exploring doing Azure AD on them. Only join, right? Finding out what does and doesn't work with the goal of getting rid of those things. So very similar to app compat activities in your environment, right? If you've identified 2,000 apps in your environment, you're clearly not going to test them all. There's not enough time in a decade to test 2,000 apps, right? It's just not going to happen. Very same thing here. You've got to identify those things that are important and those things that aren't important, and only focus on those things that are important. And those unimportant things, right? Either the users are going to have to figure out something different for themselves, just like with app compat, right? You had that one department that went off and bought that legacy application, that DOS application, right? That's on them, right? There's not much you can do that as an IT. Now, probably have to answer to the CIO about this, but hopefully the CIO is going to take your side. He understands these kinds of things. So politicking that has to happen there 100%. But so here's the real call to action, right? If you haven't done this, and this is a part of finding out what doesn't and does work in your environment. Same thing that happened with app compat. You just have to start trying, because there's no way any organization knows everything that's going on in their environment, any non-trivial organization, right? So we're talking anybody that has more than just a few hundred devices. There's always going to be some user doing something that you don't know about, whether that's going to a website, whether that's, they're stuck on IE, which isn't the case here, clearly. Whether they're accessing, maybe they've got some hardware token that they actually plug into their device to access something, right? Those kinds of things. You just don't know. And until you actually start trying these things out, you're not going to know. But that's just it, right? You shouldn't be paralyzed by fear. You shouldn't be in the analysis paralysis phase. You actually need to start going and doing this and proving, right? Not only to yourself, but everyone else, this is going to work. And until you actually get into this, you're not going to know. So you have to start doing it now and start just doing POCs where you have limited impact, right? Finding those guinea pigs. Same thing we did with Windows 10. Same thing we did with app compat. Same thing we do across the board, because there's just far too much to analyze. You just have to start and go and do it. And then don't be that old crass person sitting at the table. And if you're that person, I apologize. I've been that person at times as well. But don't be that person to say, nope, it's never going to work. This is the way we've always done it. We shouldn't have to change. Don't do that, right? That's not what IT is about. If we just think back 10 years ago, iPhones were just out. And I was definitely on the bandwagon of I hated Apple and et cetera. And I still kind of do, but that's beside the point. It's the way of the world, and you have to be able to adapt, overcome, and, the whole Marine slogan. So with that, the last slide, I'll take you back to the key points. I won't read those again. I'll look at the questions here real quick for the last couple. So PIM for the Azure AD roles, I would say look at the official documentation. I think you're talking about PIM for, well, all the Azure AD roles. Yeah, that's real specific to Azure AD, so that's not something I've had to deal with explicitly. Maybe Frank can hook you up with an Azure AD resource on that one. I don't know explicitly there. Yep. And the last one, the docs from Microsoft are very helpful. Okay, yeah. So it's all about Azure AD roles and PIMs. That's definitely not my area of expertise there. So maybe Matt, who will be on next, will be talking about security if he actually has some time at the end. He is probably a lot more familiar with that than I am, and at least can point out a link to y'all.
Yeah, I would just say that. Hi, I'm Matt. I would just say that, what was mentioned in the chat for the documentation. The documentation is awesome. PIM is it's a really easy thing to get set up. You don't have to roll it out organization wide. You can just start with a few admins being subject to PIM and the eligibility roles. I mean, the high level there is you go from being assigned a role to being assigned eligible for a role, and then you just assign different different gates for elevating your role from eligible to active. It's all time boxed. It's super awesome. The docs do a really good job. So I would take a look there if you have any questions.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, no worries. Jason, great job, man.
Thanks. I'll do one final thing here, guys, not to waste any more time. I'll put my Twitter handle. That's a great way to reach out to me. I know Matt has a Twitter handle as well. That's probably one of the easier ways to reach out, because not only I will see it, but other folks will see it on the product team, the Intune support team. Other folks see things that get tweeted at us. So it's a great way to reach out.
Awesome. Yep. Thank you, Jason.